Okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. My name is Humberto Moro, and I'm Deputy Director of Program here at DIA Art Foundation. And I am thrilled to be with two very special people here today on stage. Jordan Carter, who is curator and co-department head at DIA, and co-curator with the exhibition for Felix Gonzalez-Torres, along with Liv Kuniverdi, who's not here today, and artist Tom Burr. Full disclosure, Tom, Jordan, and I have been friends for a decade, and you're about to enter something that will feel very not formal, so please bear with us. So Tom's relationship with Felix is long and has many instances, and we're going to delve into the convergences between their practices and their relationship as peers. Their artistic, social, political concerns more broadly, they relate to identity, queerness, and more broadly, the 90s. This dialogue was initiated by the first acquisition and presentation of Felix Gonzalez-Torres' Untitled Loverboy from 1989, which is installed here at DIA Beacon. Tom is an artist who's working primarily in sculpture and installation, and his artwork explores the relationships between what's called the built environment, subjectivity, and historical persona. He attended the Educational Center for the Arts High School, a multi-arts program taught part by Yale University graduate students, where in his senior year, thesis reflected the minimalist and post-minimalist movement by integrating sculptural elements with brief poetic text. Consistently from his first exhibitions in New York City from the late 80s, Burr has placed an emphasis on spatial issues, both socio-political and formal. His work has been included in the Whitney Biennial and is found in many public art collections, including the Hammer Museum, the Whitney, the Walker Art Center, the ICA in Miami, and many others. A few lines before we start, Untitled Loverboy in this gallery is part of DIA's collection, and it's a recent gift of Charlie Pollard, and it consists of these sheer light blue curtains running down the expanse of the gallery. Innocuously infiltrates the exhibition space with a reduced formal vocabulary to introduce a queer politics and sensibility to the history of minimal and conceptual art presented idea. While we are productively complicating these histories, the work of Felix animates key concerns that are preoccupied as a self-determined artist and a public-minded activist working during the realities of a queer life in the 80s and 90s, namely, in his own words, the public and private, between the personal and social, between the fear of loss and the joy of loving, of growing, of changing, of always becoming more, of losing oneself slowly, then being replenished all over again from scratch. So, we're gonna start trying to trace a little bit the factual and situational relationship between Tom and Felix. So, Jordan, take it away, please.
Thank you, Humberto, for that lovely introduction. And it's so nice to be in conversation with you again, Tom, about the work of Felix Gonzalez-Torres and your own work. And I think it's quite fitting, actually, that we would, as an artist yourself who often positions others as sort of proxies or stand-ins for yourself, often ventriloquizing through others, often historical queer figures, and it makes a lot of sense, perhaps, that we'll have an opportunity to learn more about you by way of discussing Felix's work, life, and practice. But I guess just to start, towards the beginning of the timeline and sort of moments of convergence with Felix, we're looking here on the screen at an announcement of a group exhibition from 1989 that took place at the Paula Allen Gallery, in which your work was actually installed and dialogue with that of Felix's. So And I believe the work that you included in that exhibition was this piece here, Jones Beach Park. And maybe this is an opportunity for you to reflect on this exhibition, what it was like to sort of show alongside Felix in instances like these. Maybe talk a bit about this work, but also more broadly to give us sort of a sense or an insight into sort of that milieu, as Felix was, of course, a quasi-generational peer, but also an attitudinal peer who was sort of operating alongside you in parallel. So, yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you, Jordan. It's also wonderful to be here with Humberto and Jordan and these many layered histories that we've all had, exhibition histories, personal histories, and also quite exciting, poignant as well for me to be here thinking about the work of Felix, which looks astounding here in this gallery. I don't exactly remember. I was trying to do a sort of timeline. Felix, of course, is known for these pieces that created these sort of chronological timelines, and I was trying to sort of think of my own. I was trying to think of the first moment that I might have met Felix. It was either through Bill Arning or ACT UP or a bar or some combination thereof, probably in about 1987. Certainly that's when ACT UP started. And that's when I started to become aware of Felix through a couple of my friends. Felix was born in 1957. I was born in 1963, so there was an age difference. So he was I don't feel that age difference anymore in terms of he being a contemporary, but I certainly did at that age. And there were a group of artists that were sort of starting to have conversations about politics and formal issues and whether the two shall meet or not relative to the emerging AIDS crisis and developing AIDS crisis. The show at Paula Allen Gallery was, I remember it was not a very good gallery, but it had an amazing director. So I think it was one of these sort of secondary market galleries that allowed this very bright mind, Randy Alexander, who had come from Chicago, who went on to have his own gallery, who later did show Felix's work as well. This group show was with Felix, myself, John Lindell, and Michael Jenkins, who went on to be part of Sycamore Jenkins, the galleries. And I remember just being absolutely thrilled to be, as the youngster in the group, being thrilled to be in this particular show. And there were a constellation of shows that I was in with Felix at the time, like White Columns Benefit. I think there might have been a New Museum Benefit when it was on Lafayette, on Broadway. But it was the beginning of my sort of, in my conversations with Felix, which were not many, but were significant, my beginning of me, and partially through Felix, honing some sort of a ability to think about political issues, social issues, personal issues, as they might be embedded within formal issues, formal strategies, formal artworks. And for me, Felix's work was one of the ways into that possibility at that time.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about the work that you included in that show?
I might, yeah. I actually had two works in that show, as I recall. There was Jones Beach State Park, and then there was a photographic work this is an image that Jordan has here of my Torrington project, which is both a studio and something else, and I guess we're probably going to talk about that a little bit later. But the other work is in what I call the clinic and needs to be repaired, but it was a photographic work that included my partner at the time, Ulhon, who again, probably it will come up later. But Jones Beach State Park, the work on the wall in the center of that image, was part of a series of early bulletin boards, as I call them, that were about public spaces in New York. city parks, primarily, that were where various publics would converge, and I would cull or pick up the texts that were the public-facing texts that would be found at a park that would be rules and regulations or descriptions or visitor information. And I would juxtapose that, as you see on the plywood panel, with these monochromatic spaces that had plexiglass sheets over them that would then sort of reflect the space, reflect the viewer. So it would be a bit of a collapse between the site that I was thinking about elsewhere and the site that you're in front of you.
And as I recall it, in that exhibition, Felix included sort of this variation of a minimal black cube in the form of a magazine rack with an endless supply of photocopies. So in a way, we're both sort of mobilizing sort of these aesthetics of administration and sort of these sort of strategies that one might associate with 1960s, 70s conceptual art or minimal and conceptual art. And I'm curious if at that time or now reflecting, you had a thought as to what it was that was drawing you both to these sorts of formal strategies as a way of addressing other, perhaps political, social, or even identity-oriented concerns.
You know, yeah, there's probably lots of answers to that. I was very charmed to have in my introduction, which I don't think has ever happened, a reference to where I went to high school. That doesn't often happen to me. I did go to a place called Educational Center for the Arts in New Haven, Connecticut, that was a sort of magnet for regional public schools. And so if you went to a public school, I was in a suburb of New Haven, you would go for the second half of your day to Educational Center for the Arts, which was a revelation for me. It was an absolute revelation. I knew it was the cool place to go, that's why I wanted to go there. But it was almost after I got there that I decided I wanted to be an artist. And it was, as Humberto said in his introduction, taught primarily by Yale grad students. And post-minimalism was very much in the air at that time. That's what I became sort of, I was a sponge and I just absorbed all of that information, and I, at the same time, would learn about figures in that same moment. This is the late 1970s. Learn about someone like Andy Warhol, and even to my young brain, I was always trying to make sense of those things, make sense of the queerness that I saw coming through. I wouldn't have called it that then, but the gayness, I would have said, that was coming through the pop or the Warholian sensibility, and trying to kind of square that in some ways with this aesthetic impulses of minimalism and post-minimalism that so attracted me. And it was later, I think in New York, probably primarily through the lens of feminism, that I sort of gained the tools to sort of start to put that together. So that is all to say that I think that my earliest infatuations were about minimalist and post-minimalist art. It's later that I felt the need to somehow mobilize that and justify that and elaborate that and make that something other than an infatuation and make it meaningful to others outside myself and to my current moment that I found in the world that I found myself in New York. I don't know if Felix's trajectory was similar or not. I do know that at the time, it's changed quite a bit since then. At the time, this felt like uncharted territory, to mine the forms of minimalism, to mine the forms of post-minimalism. I also was interested in mining the figures of minimalism and post-minimalism, not simply the forms. And it's kind of odd because I think at the time I would have thought that, I remember going to a couple of shows that Felix's work was in. One was called Real Life, and that might have been at White Columns, maybe. And then certainly I remember being at, and this is when I knew Felix a little bit better, but at the gallery that went on to support Felix throughout his life, Andrea Rosen, her inaugural exhibition in 1990 was the show with Felix Gonzalez-Torres, and his stacks, which very clearly resonated against and with minimalism, were very prominent in that exhibition. And that, for me, that was the first time that I saw Felix as really dealing with, rather than conceptual strategies, also minimalism strategies.
You set up this sort of anachronistic transition quite well in terms of this idea of transitioning from gayness to queerness, and incidentally, you sort of reunited with Felix quite intentionally in a 2019 exhibition titled Queer Abstraction, in which you installed your installation Deep Purple in conversation with his Untitled Water, sort of a companion piece, if you will, to Untitled Loverboy, with the light blue curtains here, light blue beaded, more aqua blue beaded curtains. But maybe I'll pass it over to Humberto to sort of ask a few questions around this very poignant installation and conversation that you mobilized between the two of you.
Yeah, what's really interesting to me is that, as you say, there are these moments in which Felix and you have come together physically in New York City, in the social sort of like environment, but there is also the life of the works, right? And the life of the works has brought us together in different situations, maybe less control by the artist and more control by what the works actually are. And this is one of them. We'll speak a little bit about another one later on, but I'm interested in thinking not only because of the image we're seeing here and the exhibition we're seeing here, but also because of the relationship that there is with Dia specifically, and the way in which programmatically we're looking at minimalist and post-minimalist practices in a different way, and we're bringing different sort of materials, and we're kind of like thinking about the canon that we have helped to create in a critical and different way. So I think that there is a very specific relationship between your work, Deep Purple, and its point of origin. So maybe you can speak a little bit about where and how that work originates, and sort of like the formal decisions that are embedded in this work and what they express.
Yes, so Deep Purple is a work that I made in 2000, in the year 2000, for an exhibition in Braunschweig, Germany. It was a survey exhibition of my work, and I wanted to make a new work to accompany the existing works. And I took a long time getting to this particular piece. I remember I have recently, because of sort of archival digs that I've been doing of myself, of my work, of my analog files, I've found notes and drawings and things like this, and it's kind of humorous to me to see how I sort of backed into this. I remember thinking about things like the barriers on highways, sound barriers. I was interested in the form before I got to Richard Serra. I was interested in creating something that it was a Palladian villa that was the Braunschweig Kunstverein, and it was about one room deep all across, with windows to the back, and I wanted something that you could see out of every one of the back windows, and I wanted to think about something monochromatic. I don't think I've actually even talked about this work like this before, that it sort of happened by sort of in a circuitous, somewhat accidental way. Somehow along that thinking process, I became, because my earlier works that were all coming from, really kind of derived from Robert Smithson in many ways, thinking particularly his final essay, Frederick Law Olmsted and the Dialectical Landscape, all of those part pieces were coming out of this kind of writing, and what I felt was an incomplete piece of writing. And I wanted to answer to that. Then I really became very, very interested in disappearing into form to a certain degree. I felt I had put a lot of material into the world, a lot of ideas that were quite, got attached to me very quickly. And I wanted to create some sort of very subconscious camouflage in my work. So I started to come to the idea of the monochrome, and I started to then somehow came to playing with Richard Serra's Tilted Arc. So Richard Serra's Tilted Arc, which is the history of the 1980s in many ways. It was erected in 1980 or 81, and it was dismantled or came down in 1989. Richard Serra's Corten steel, probably the most famous public art debacle of the 20th century, was Corten steel, 120 feet by 12 feet. Mine was 2/3 the size, at 80 feet and 8 feet high, rather than the sort of industrial bravura of Corten steel. Mine was made out of plywood, out of sections. Mine could be transported, be moved around, whereas Serra's work was considered by himself, by the artist, to be destroyed should the site that it was created for be eradicated. Mine was more promiscuous, more opportunistic, playful, irreverent. So I wanted to create a sort of reflection on that notion of permanence and that particular brand of masculinity in some ways is also what I think I was responding to. The color came from a desire to play with the idea of the monochrome. And to me, purple at the time seemed to be almost the most artificial color that I could come up with, that I thought about it relative, because it was seen in the landscape, that seemed to be somewhat about decor, and obviously has lots of references to queerness, but I wanted it to kind of get stretched over something that was also architectural, physical, and spatial.
And of course, you know, in many ways, this piece, Untitled Loverboy, and Untitled Water that you put into conversation with Deep Purple could also be seen through the lens of the monochrome, or even sort of an affront to minimalism's chromophobia, and potentially, by extension, queerphobia. But I'm curious if you could talk just a little bit more about why you chose, in this instance, to put these two works in conversation, because I understand this to be sort of a curatorial gesture as well as an artistic one in the context of this group exhibition.
This exhibition, Queer Modernism, right? That was
Queer Abstraction.
Queer Abstraction. I'm just scanning the room quickly. I didn't really want to be in this exhibition. I struggled with it a little bit. It wasn't, sometimes these exhibitions can do a couple of things, these large survey exhibitions like this. They can open things up, they can be conversations, they can be political, they can also shut things down, and they can conclude a chapter, they can put a period rather than a ... on certain kinds of work. So I had ambivalences about what that meant. I'm not even sure I understand exactly what queer modernism is, but I liked the curator, Jared Ledesma, quite a lot. We had very productive conversations. And it was at the Des Moines Arts Center, and the Des Moines Arts Center has 3 pavilions, or 3 different spaces, museum spaces that are built by 3 different architects. And I really wanted to be in the IMP brutalist space. And originally there was another work that was being considered, and that's not something I wanted to do, because I wanted to kind of I wanted it to be an exhibition within an exhibition. So when the idea that the Felix Gonzalez-Torres Foundation was interested in participating, and I think maybe they had some conditions or thoughts about it too, we started to think about exploding the space in a certain way with this kind of chromatic thing. Because in some ways, Deep Purple has always been obviously heavily about its color, its chromatic intensity, its strangeness. Felix's works have also had that kind of saturation, right? Sometimes, I mean, the thing with Felix's work, these works could be that it could be as narrow as 8 feet wide, or it could be as expansive as this. That kind of retraction and expansion, contraction and expansion, was very interesting to me. And likewise, Deep Purple, in its kind of being contrary or contrariness to, you know, Sarah's work, also could expand and contract. You know, when it's all these different segments. It's the size of it. Each piece is the size of a standard piece of plywood, and then that's sort of like a ship is put together with ribs. It's been installed several times, and I always thought at the beginning that it would be considered a work on paper, meaning a contract, and it would get remade every time, in a kind of sort of hugging that history of conceptual art that way. It just didn't go down that way. So after I made it, and then it came to the Whitney Museum, they shipped it across the ocean, and then it went back to Lausanne, Switzerland. And I started to become attracted to that idea that the original material was starting to age and was starting to be there. So that's something I know that you wanted to talk about as well. But when it was installed in Lausanne, Switzerland, the curator at the time, Florence, and I think she was thinking in meters and I was thinking in feet. And then it was inside, and it was this salon room, and it was a week before the exhibition, and the goddamn piece wouldn't fit. So I went into a room by myself and thought, so that I didn't, you know, attack Florence, whose responsibility I felt it was to have done the correct math. It was her museum. And but then, so I decided to publish. We were doing a talk for, you know, a kind of preview for the exhibition. A large catalog came out later, but we did a kind of dialogue. And I incorporated into the logic of the work that not only was it able to be various sites, various locations and shifting, but it also could contract and potentially expand. So I kind of gave it validity. No one noticed. It was only one section down. You wouldn't see it in the space. But anyway, that was in my mind a little bit also in Des Moines about the fact that it also mutated. It also changed the way, and if I'm right with this work of Felix's, this was the largest, most expansive instance of it. Felix never was able to realize during his lifetime these kinds of complete expansive, where the logic just keeps going, and the work really becomes architectural, which was so exciting for me to see, because so often Felix's works, these curtain works, these bead works, were often almost a quiet moment relative to a group show, a quiet moment relative to other works. And here they become, here and also in Des Moines Art Center, become truly architectural elements. So the softness, the domestic, the tenderness comes up against real architecture. And that's what I wanted to see happen here. And the way I mutated Deep Purple in this instance was to put it through the plate glass window.
I want to come back to a point that Jordan raised, which is sort of like the phobias of minimalism, to say it in a way. And thinking specifically about resources, for example, because gay-identified communities, then now queer-identified communities, you know, broadly we can say that operate from the margins, and resources are a big element in the conversation. So, you know, I'm thinking, for example, about Kembra Fowler and like her availavism, kind of like thinking about like what can you do with what you have, and in a way, this idea of domesticity, of materials, of kind of like pivoting in spaces to make things work, seems all too familiar for queer communities, and the way that we all have to insert ourselves in different male-dominated spaces. So I just wanted to take a moment to think about what that does to the work in terms of how materials are chosen, or they decay, or they're enacted in the space. I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I would venture that it was very similar for Felix, or somewhat parallel for Felix, but as I mentioned earlier, my sort of journey into what the work that I would have considered my grown-up work, not my Educational Center for the Arts high school work, but thereafter, really was through the teachings. I went at School of Visual Arts in particular, and then the Whitney Independent Study Program, of largely feminist thinkers and feminist practitioners. And my generation, or the generation that was happening in the art world at the time, was the pictures generation, of course. So it was Barbara Kruger, it was Sherry Levine, it was Louise Lawler, it was Martha Rossler. But I also had instructors like Mae Stevens and Nancy Spiro, who had even earlier thought about how the personal, the domestic, the fragile, the impermanent, the anecdotal, the diaristic, all of these things which were sort of in opposition to masculinist official discourse, whether in art or elsewhere, or in politics, how they were almost shameful, almost embarrassing, but therefore potentially transgressive and powerful for that reason. And that was something that started to very much frame my thinking. But the other thing that comes to mind from what you said relative to materials is something that also is this kind of survival strategy, opportunistic survival strategies, right? So clearly Felix was always involved in using, I mean, this looks very, very elegant, and of course it's about scale, but he would use whatever materials were sort of readily available. So that's also kind of has its queer angle, but it also has its history in minimalism too, doesn't it? So my use of plywood, because it was the most available sort of zero-degree material, had its precedence on the elsewhere in this museum space, as did Felix's use of the light bulbs has a relationship to Flavin, but a different moment, different history.
Before we move from this very generative piece, Deep Purple, I want to return to something that you said, Tom, that actually I think resonates with the conversation at this moment, which is this sort of attitude of wanting to have it both ways that you sort of demonstrated with Deep Purple, you know, both wanting it to be a patinaed object, sort of singular work, but at the same time wanted the opportunity for it to exist sort of as a dematerialized certificate-based work that you could sort of iterate and manifest in new contexts and conditions. So this sort of also seems like this sort of critical ambivalence or sort of this dualities or sort of this sort of fugitive nature of like of how you're positioning the work is something that Felix was also doing in terms of a work just like this, Untitled Loverboy, which exists, you know, even when it's not manifest. It's something that, as you were saying, can be very domestic, but also can operate at scale and sort of become something architectural, environmental, and even monumental, even through its minimal or sort of, you know, insignificant means, if you will. So I guess I'm thinking a little bit about sort of duplicity in a way, because Felix himself, in relationship to the charged nature of blue in this piece, you know, which many people have reflected on in relationship to its signaling or signifying of boys, of melancholy, of memory, of water, of hospital gowns, of romance and the erotic, you know, he would sort of often rebuff these claims and sort of want to keep it very open and unfixed in terms of its meaning, and sort of say, you know, it's just really a light blue. Right. So, yeah, I'm curious to sort of reflect on sort of this refusal of fixedness in relationship to both the discursive nature of the work, but also its formal vessels, if you will.
I'll sort of wander back through that from the thing you said most recently. You know, Felix's apartment, he had a light blue wall in his apartment. I remember being very impressed by that. It was an accent wall. And it was kind of, and he didn't have a lot of things in there besides that. And it was also an era when museums were doing that a bit, like there would be one wall that would be like a color. But whether it was this light blue or another light blue, it was light blue. And that kind of goes back in some ways to this complicated thing about personal affections, attractions, versus how you mobilize those things in artwork. So I happen to know that this is a color that Felix really liked, that he really loved. But then, maybe that's not enough, right, in the world. I don't think it is, and I don't think he did. So how do we make this color interesting to other people? Why does it mean so much to me? And how do you kind of excavate that interest and that desire? So on the one hand, it is this sort of baby blue, baby boy blue kind of thing. And the medical discourse that kind of comes into it, which you have to think about when you think about those years. And you think about what Felix was going through, what we were all going through, with the medical crisis that we were going through, the lives that were being lost, how much time we were spending in hospitals. But then it's also very interesting, I don't think this is really a question you asked me, but I just wanted to say something about the title Loverboy. Because, this work could go in so many different directions. You could call it, blue curtain for expansive space. You could, which would be a very Dia Art Foundation kind of title from another era, right?
Untitled.
Or Untitled, which Felix always played. I think he was the original one to play with Untitled, which is by like saying yes and no at the same time. Like, I don't have anything to say, I have a lot to say. Because then parenthetically you say da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. But by saying Loverboy in relationship to this curtain, which doesn't seem to have anything to do with the curtain, you're opening up a whole, almost, plethora of associations and thoughts and desires that seem to go back to the artist's biography.
Especially because there are other works in which the word Loverboy comes alive again.
Yeah.
So it is a concept that's coming back either in the singular or the plural, right, as Loverboys. So, I think that is very interesting, thinking about visibility, which is something that we have not addressed yet, which that idea of private, public visibility of queer communities in the 90s vis-a-vis the AIDS crisis. And I'm curious if you can speak a little bit about that, because in a way, Deep Purple also allows possibilities of concealing and obstructing visibility. So maybe you can say a little bit about those parallels.
Right, so much to say. One of the things that interested me about Richard Serra's work was the way it was used and misused. So there would be, how to make this short. So like Carnegie, the piece that was in Pittsburgh, became a chamber that was used by people for sex, for drugs, for being out of view, for people who didn't have a place to sleep. It had all these quote-unquote misuses, right? Or other than what the sculpture may or may not have been intended for, or what the institutions or the spaces or the people who ever were managing the work had intended for that work. That, of course, interested me, right? That was a kind of, the graffiti, the things that happened to Tilted Arc, the urine stains across it, of course, the Corten steel, of course, they made you think of Warholian queer references to the urine paintings. All of that kind of made me think about how these structures were not simply forms, but they were spaces. They were spaces of concealment. They were spaces of being out of view. They were forms of protection in many ways. They were skins that formed a kind of protection. And that I wanted to kind of amplify, underscore with Deep Purple as well.
Maybe it's a good...
I guess in sake of time, we can move forward to...
Maybe we could stop here for a moment, because we've touched on with by way of Sarah and this tilted arc, this idea of sort of a radical or obstinate site specificity, to which Felix was quite the opposite in terms of envisioning work that could exist in more than one location at once, and which really embraced sort of a sense of multiplicity. And in the pandemic, in 2020, the Felix Gonzalez-Torres Foundation sort of mobilized this networked international manifestation of his Untitled, I believe it's Fortune Cookie Corner or something along those lines. And you were one of 1,000 or so invitees who were sort of prompted to enact this piece in their space, and sort of the idea being this constellation of spaces around the world would sort of constitute this sort of site, this sort of expanded site. But as you waited to receive your fortune cookie supply, you had selected your corner staircase location, and as sort of a proxy or stand-in, installed a shoe drawing by Ul Hone. And so I'm curious to, for you to reflect on this gesture and participating in this expanded sort of event site of Felix's work, but why you decided to use Ul's drawing in this drawing. And of course, I can't help but think about how Felix's piles often are themselves proxies or surrogates for a body, often a body in decline, and sort of markers of potential corporeal loss. And how we can begin to sort of think about that in relationship to the gesture in which you've done here in relationship to Ul, which of course relates to your own personal biography.
Right. So this fortune cookie project, I know it received a lot of bad press. I mean, there were critics of it. I found it sort of generative. So during lockdown, we also had like some supply chain issues, right? So the fortune cookies did take a long time to get to me. And as I was sort of thinking about it, and as I was documenting it, I knew the space that it would be in, which meant something to me relative to Felix. And so I had a partner named Ul Hone, who I met in 1987 at the Whitney Independent Study Program in New York. Ul was a painter who had come from Germany, studied with Gerhard Richter, and then we became boyfriends and lived together in a couple of different locations. Ul died in 1995. Felix died in 96. And I have become something of one of the people, there are many, including his mother, who have been kind of shepherds of the work in some way and of the legacy, trying to get the work into certain collections, trying to get books made, trying to get visibility, trying to create continued living discourse around his work. So I put this drawing there that happens to be in my living room anyway into that corner to hold that spot in a very, very casual way at the time. This drawing, this is a complete tangent, but it's certainly interesting to me. I hope it is to other people. Ul did in the final year of his life, when he knew he was dying, his eyesight was going, and he did what he called the revision series. And he was always a very prolific artist, one of these people that was always painting or drawing, very different from me, and where I'm always stymied. In the last year of his life, started to go back and repaint and redraw works that he had made when he was 16 and 17 years old. So this shoe drawing is the revision. So it's this layered thing, and they were showed in American Fine Arts Company, the gallery that I was showing at the time too, on Worcester Street in New York. So these kinds of intersections, these kinds of parallels, these kinds of equivalencies were always interesting to me, and it seemed very Felix to me to kind of let Ul hold the space until Felix arrived.
That's super potent. And This piece here, I mean, there's a lot to talk about around this exhibition, Body Building, which in many ways was you sort of occupying in various ways through various media, the Pirelli Tire Building in New Haven, Connecticut, that was done by architect Marcel Breuer, gorgeous, beardless building that had actually undergone sort of a quasi-partial demolition, including sort of, I believe it was the research and development area offices that had been sort of amputated off of the building and sort of re-put together along this wall that we're looking at. And as sort of a gesture, maybe a quasi-elegiac gesture, you took this white, this piece, white wall wound, which is this long white cloth, basically, and lined all of the perimeter of the windows of that wall, almost as sort of a suturing gesture, a sort of dressing of a wound, sort of speaking to an architectural trauma, if you will. Of course, there are so many formal resonances with the piece that is behind us right now in terms of this sort of traversal of the serial windows, and sort of the use and mobilization of a soft material at such a large scale. But I find it interesting to sort of think about this idea of, we were talking a bit about medical discourse, and I can't help but read sort of a gauze-like sensibility to both this material and this sort of dressing gesture on the building, and how that might return us to an idea of thinking about Felix's Blue Curtains and this idea of the hospital gown, or the idea of the medical or the clinical in terms of its evocation of the body and corporality in this space, and the traumas, of course, associated with that at its moment of production.
Yeah, when Jordan and I were talking about images for this talk, I thought of this one, which wasn't in our original roster of thinking, but I loved its immediate relationship to what we're seeing behind us. That interested, the way you treat a physical space and mark it or tag it with the kind of most ephemeral of materials. In New Haven, it was very specifically about, as Jordan explained, part of the building had been destroyed. It's only very, very recently that brutalist architecture would be saved at all. Because it was a modular structure, because it was Marcel Breuer's modular structure for the building, preservationists had come in and stopped the demolition, but that hole, that gap that was left was able to be, I use the word sutured, by the existing modular structure. And I wanted to treat the body, the building as a body. It was part of a project that was the initiative of my gallery in New York, and I could choose any location. I originally thought about going out west because I'm so trained in this idea of, I'm an East Coast artist, I would go out to the desert, or I would play with that whole mythology. But then I chose New Haven, which is where I was born and grew up, and that brought a lot up for me that featured or figured in this project. So that band of material is gauzy. I wanted it to be both a wound, a bandage for a wound, but also it's the same material that IKEA uses to advertise on the front of that building, because that building is in New Haven is owned by IKEA. Now it's a hotel that they sold. It's the Hotel Marcel. So I wanted it to kind of have a dual life that way. But in thinking about Felix's work here in preparation for this, or as soon as I knew that it, quite frankly, you guys had installed it here all those many months ago, I started thinking about it in relationship to this, and I'm not sure that I would have thought about this work, Loverboy, quite so strongly in relationship to this idea of trauma or a wound, had I not sort of connected those two things and not seen it here in such an exaggerated way. There's something about seeing this here, and as I said, I've not always seen Felix's surface works or architectural works where they weren't juxtaposed with other artworks. Just to see it absolutely alone with the space lets a lot of other readings in that way. And that was the reason that I thought it sort of tied into this work as well.
Which, as we were speaking before at the talk, I think bodybuilding sort of like was a prelude to what you're doing now, which is the Torrington Project, which is this idea of a durational space in which you can explore and use and sort of like test the limits of a space, of a given space, and we'll get there. But I wanted to maybe jump to, and just being mindful of time, to a project that we did in 2017, if I'm not mistaken, which was kind of like a dual exhibition at the SCAD Museum of Art, titled Sedimental, and sort of like public art installation titled No Access, which is
2018.
2017, I think it started, and
okay.
it ended in 18.
He was my curator.
Yeah. So, you know, we were, at the time, I think we're thinking about these ideas of bodies, visibility, and sort of like mediation, and these series of objects that are essentially a mediation of reality via a dark glass, which comes from an inspiration of a tool to see the landscape. So maybe you can talk a little bit about where those objects are coming from, and what do they do in the space.
So this was a work that I did first in the Cologne Sculpture Park in Cologne, Germany, and then we brought it to SCAD, Savannah College of Art and Design, which is where Humberto was at the time, rather. And it's called No Access. And they are, how many letters are in the alphabet? 26? There were 26 of them. Is that 26? Yeah. 26. I'm sorry, yes. Right, some of them stayed in Cologne. I don't remember which letters. But they were these screens, these reflective spaces that were, in my mind, sort of loosely based on what was called the black glass, which was a 19th century mechanism for painting landscape paintings. So it was about the picturesque, and so you would have a mirrored black surface and a painter, and it became a kind of a popular thing that sort of Sunday painters would use, and you would hold it up, and it would reflect the landscape both framed and contained and pictured, but also in sharp contrast. So this school of thought about the picturesque occurred. And I liked that very much in relationship to, you know, exactly what I just, you know, these kinds of things and the way we sort of self-monitor and survey issues of surveillance, and but particularly self-surveillance. So that was what those works were, and they needed to be excessive. There were many of them, so you almost can't escape them in some ways.
Yeah, what I find interesting about that is that there were moments in which your body was sort of like reflected in many of them, and you could see what seemed sort of like a mirage or kind of like this illusion of a myriad of bodies.
Yeah. And
this kind of like uncertainty, I think, is the place where also Felix's work has evolved and thrived in a way. Mm-hmm. And maybe just to close this conversation so we have time for a couple questions, Jordan can speak a little bit about the transformations.
The renovations.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, we've talked a little bit about, or we've evoked in this space rather, Felix's portraits, which take the form of, you know, these dates of some significance, often, you know, on a frieze, like height on a wall, sort of creating sort of this, you know, text-based, associative sort of portrait of a person. And perhaps similarly, perhaps distinctly, you have also employed text as sort of a conceptual strategy towards the evocation of a place or a portrait of a place, in particular thinking through renovations of downtown Manhattan locations, I believe around 1990, with Dia Art Foundation actually being sort of a core marker in some of this activity and change in the built environment. And so I'm curious just for you to maybe reflect on that use of text, on how you've sort of mobilized text as a way to, cultivate a sense of a portrait of a certain set of coordinates, of a certain moment, of a certain development, and how that might or may not reflect on Felix's practice.
These are some images of a work that I wrote. It was actually a few years later than that. It was in '96. And it was called 8 Renovations, a series of constellations across Manhattan. Yes, 8 Renovations, colon, a series. And they were all spaces that had something to do with either my life or my work in New York at the time. They were all spaces that were in flux, meaning places that were registering change, were being closed down, were being opened up, were layering their meanings. And I was proposing within each one in this initial text, it later became a work, the renovation of the space. And the renovation would simply be that I would take green sheetrock, this was all hypothetical, possible, sheetrock, the type used in bathrooms and kitchens, and create monochromatic interventions into the spaces. So there was one of them was about a place called Wonder Bar, which was a gay bar on 6th Street in New York that had, coincidentally, not coincidentally, previously been 303 Gallery, which was next to American Fine Arts Gallery, so these kinds of layerings would occur. And I think I proposed to put the green sheetrock down next to the DJ booth all the way down, creating a large, long monochrome. There were spaces like the Ramble in Central Park. There were bathrooms that had closed. There was a apartment of a friend of mine on Renwick Street, and there was Dia Art Foundation as well, which was a very new, was the anchor store, if you will, of a very new emerging gallery district, which I was very close to because the galleries that I was associated with at that time, Colin DeLand at American Fine Arts Company and Pat Hearn Gallery, were very involved in that initiative of the beginnings of Chelsea. So that kind of tracking of my interests and where you might find me or where you might find my work, and these coincidences, which I think is quite similar. As you say it now, I'm not sure I was thinking about that as coherently at the time, but relative to this beautiful, seemingly coincidence of events that Felix does in his timelines. So, and they're ever evolving, of course, but that this thing. There's a photograph I used to like to see that makes me explain this better. There's a photograph of Robert Smithson on a couch next to Andy Warhol. And I remember thinking, when I saw that photograph when I was young, I kind of had learned about these people as if they were worlds apart, that they were in entirely different rooms of history. But then to see them together on a couch is a little bit how Felix does these things, so that something like the first ACT UP meeting in blah, blah, blah of 1987, March of 1987, might also be the same year that Andy Warhol died. And maybe you have to start to go, well, what do these things have to do with each other? Maybe that's not a good example, but you know what I mean. This kind of seeming coincidence or randomness, this kind of seemingly random selection, in fact, creates meaning. It, in fact, probably builds meaning in a way that might be more accurate, more real, more felt than any kind of standard chronological historical account.
Well, maybe that's a good place to end for the moment, and thank you for allowing us to create these perhaps quasi-speculative but nonetheless real proximities between your work and Felix's today. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you,
guys.
Thank you,
Humberto.
And thanks everyone for coming.
I think we have time for a couple questions, if there are any.
No questions? No,
There's
there we
one
go.
here.
Oh, actually, we have a mic coming, if that's okay. Coming around the front.
Hi, thank you so much. I don't know if this is an appropriate question to ask, but if Felix were alive right now, okay, maybe bad question. But if Felix were alive today and you had the opportunity to create a collaborative work with him in person, what would that be?
You know, in some ways, I know this is it seems a little bit of a, I hope it doesn't seem like a lazy response, but in some ways it would be that installation you just saw in Des Moines. You know, I thought a lot about Felix and his voice when we were doing that exhibition. So in some ways, this has happened to me several times in my life, that I've had to work with someone that was alive once and then are no longer alive. And I've sort of chosen not to consider that work stopping in a certain way. And Felix is probably one of the most rich examples of someone whose life, physical life ended, but had already impregnated the work with possibilities of existing without him. And that's something that is very generous, has a lot of foresight. And so when I did that exhibition, it was as if this was the ultimate thing with Felix's work coming alive. And I think that is in no small part because the work did allow itself to rise to new occasions, to change, to be mutable in a way that had it just been an artwork that had certain conditions around it that were restrictive and had to be sort of almost died with the artist. And so given a few moments, I would come up with a million other myriad continued dialogue between Felix and myself. But for the purposes of the question, I would say that that felt that way for me.
Any others?
I hope everybody heard that. So the wide wall wound that I did in New Haven, it wasn't alone in that exhibition. There were always also these railings and these other sort of pieces that had to demark space. So I was thinking very much about a kind of forensic kind of examination of, as you put it, and I like that, Ronnie, a kind of crime scene. I was also, the thing I was doing in that project was conflating the building and myself. So my own history, I was built a few years before this building was built. In 1970 was when the building was erected. And the other thing that was sort of happening with that project was I was considering the building and its wound a witness to things that had occurred in New Haven at that time. So if the building had occurred, had been opened up in 1970, also that's why I ushered Jean Genet into the project, because Jean Genet had been, again, about sort of simultaneity and this seeming randomness, had come to New Haven to give his sort of now famous May Day speech on behalf of the Black Panther Party, who were convening in New Haven because of the trials of one of the party members on the Green. So that kind of simultaneity, what does that building being created in May of 1970 have to do with that speech, have to do with Annie Albers, have to do with Jim Morrison, have to do with J. Edgar Hoover. And that band of fabric in some ways was a way of marking the whole building, touching the whole building as being not dissimilar from this, as being something to be thought about. Protecting it, as you say, kind of cordoning it off. It was also, which I haven't been outside here, but similarly what I was trying to do with Deep Purple in its very first instance in Braunschweig, Germany, I was aware that that white piece of material would be the only thing you'd see from outside the building. So the building, it was that idea that there's something going on in there, that this is, and it's partially screening it, but only partially.
It also reminded me in some ways of Piero Manzoni's linea, like a way of measuring time.
Yeah.
Or, just what length of life does a building have, what length of life does a human have.
I've installed that work in Torrington, and the Torrington Project, where there are a series of windows in this industrial space, and it's much shorter than the Pirelli building was. But the other thing to know about this work, which you can see a little bit, is yes, it was about the windows, and yes, it was about this straight line, but it was equally about this toilet paper roll gone awry at the end. It's like the cat that got the toilet paper. So there's also this kind of like suggestion of chaos, suggestion of unraveling, and suggestion of continuation.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And please keep an eye on our programs. We have a coming conversation with Liliana Porter in Bridgehampton next weekend, if you happen to be out east. And thank you, Tom. Thank you, Jordan. Thank you, everyone.